What if everything unfolding around us right now is not random at all? The confusion inside the church, the weakening of family structures, emotional and psychological collapse seen in younger generations, the rise of radical sexual and gender ideologies, and even the growing sense of spiritual emptiness that seems to sit behind people's eyes. What if these are not isolated social changes, parts of a much larger unfolding pattern? The speaker begins with a provocative claim that what appears to be cultural chaos may actually follow a coordinated structure, not driven by visible political systems alone, but by a deeper spiritual reality. According to this perspective, what is happening is not accidental or spontaneous, but strategic in nature, unfolding over time with intention and direction that most people do not recognize. Drawing from decades of experience in exorcism ministry, the speaker claims to have encountered cases where non-human entities, questioned under strict religious authority, describe patterns of influence that appear organized rather than random. The presented is that the disorder visible in modern society resembles something structured, something that behaves less like uncontrolled decay and more like a deliberate process with stages and objectives. To support this idea, reference is made to the biblical passage in Ephesians 6:12, which describes human struggle not as being against physical opponents, but against spiritual powers and authorities operating in darkness. While many believers may hear this passage in passing, the speaker argues that those who work closely with cases of spiritual oppression treat it as a literal framework for understanding reality, not just symbolic language. From this perspective, the claim is made that these influences are not passive or distant. Instead, they are already active in everyday environments, homes, schools, communities, and even within the thought patterns of individuals. Emphasis is placed on immediacy. This is not something approaching in the future, but something already in motion. The speaker then addresses a common misconception about spiritual evil, suggesting that popular media and entertainment have shaped a distorted image of it. Rather than dramatic visible manifestations, the more common form of influence is described as subtle, gradual, and psychological. Instead of sudden disruptions, it is compared to long-term erosion, something that works slowly over generations. An analogy is introduced. Rather than a sudden attack, it resembles a prolonged siege. In such a scenario, nothing is broken immediately. Instead, essential systems are weakened over time. Resources are cut off, internal stability is reduced, and resistance gradually diminishes until collapse becomes inevitable. In this framing, cultural and moral structures are not destroyed overnight, but weakened step by step from within. The speaker stresses that this interpretation is not meant to be vague or purely symbolic. Instead, it is presented as a structured understanding of how influence operates at a spiritual level. While acknowledging that demonic beings within this belief system do not possess absolute knowledge of the future, is argued that they possess intelligence far beyond human capability and have observed human behavior across long stretches of history. This extended observation, the argument goes, allows them to understand patterns of behavior, cultural cycles, psychological vulnerabilities with high precisions. From there, the discussion shifts toward hierarchy. The claim is made that spiritual forces are not chaotic or unorganized, but structured in ranks and roles, similar to a complex institution with different levels of authority and specialization. This hierarchy is interpreted through theological language, such as principalities, powers, and dominions, suggesting a layered system of influence rather than a single unified force. The speaker further describes, based on claimed exorcism experiences, that when spiritual entities are questioned under religious authority, they reportedly reveal that different roles exist within their influence. Some are associated with intellectual confusion, others with emotional distortion, and others with behavioral or moral breakdown. The suggestion is that influence is distributed across multiple dimensions of human life rather than focused in one area. Expanding this idea to a larger scale, the argument is made that what affects individuals is mirrored at the level of societies and civilizations. Patterns that weaken a single person, confusion, isolation, loss of identity, moral disorientation, described as being scaled up across populations, eventually shaping entire cultures. At this stage, the focus shifts specifically toward the family structure. The speaker identifies the breakdown of the family, especially the weakening role of fathers, as a central point of vulnerability. In this view, erosion of paternal authority is not just a social issue, but a foundational destabilization of the domestic unit, which is considered as essential for emotional and spiritual development. The argument continues by connecting fatherlessness to wider societal consequences, including crime, addiction, psychological instability, and loss of belief systems. Rather than treating these as unrelated social statistics, the speaker presents them as predictable outcomes of weakening the family structure. Theological layer is then added to this claim. The family is described as a reflection of a deeper spiritual reality, symbolically connected to the idea of divine relationship and structure. In this interpretation, disrupting the family is not only a social transformation, but also a symbolic attack on foundational religious understanding. From here, discussion broadens to historical cultural change, particularly focusing on shifts that took place during the mid-20th century. The speaker argues that movements associated with the sexual revolution did not emerge spontaneously, but were preceded by decades of intellectual and cultural development within academic, psychological, and media institutions. Specific thinkers and movements are referenced as part of this intellectual groundwork, suggesting that cultural transformation often begins long before it becomes visible in mainstream society. The claim is made that ideas move from academic theory into cultural norms over time, eventually shaping laws, education systems, and public behavior. However, the speaker emphasizes that human actors alone are not seen as the full explanation. Instead, they are framed as participants, knowingly or unknowingly, in a larger spiritual process. Some may intentionally promote these ideas, while others may simply be influenced by prevailing intellectual trends without awareness of deeper implications. The section closes with a key assertion that modern cultural decline, including reduced religious practice, weakening moral frameworks, declining belief systems, is not accidental or purely organic. Instead, it is presented as the result of long-term, layered influence acting across institutions, ideas, and generations. At this point, the foundation is set for a deeper breakdown of what the speaker identifies as the main pillars of this influence and how they allegedly operate across different aspects of society. Building on this foundation, the focus now shifts from general cultural patterns to what are described as the key structural pillars behind this long-term influence. The claim is that these are not random trends, but recurring mechanisms that consistently appear across different areas of society, shaping how people think, feel, and behave over time. The first pillar described is the suppression of intellectual clarity. In this view, the ability to think in clear, structured terms about truth, morality, and existence is gradually weakened. Instead of encouraging deep philosophical reasoning or stable moral frameworks, modern culture is said to replace these with emotionally driven interpretations of reality. Truth becomes less about objective understanding and more about personal experience or individual perception. This shift, according to the argument, has a direct consequence. When people lose the ability to reason from first principles, they also lose the ability to evaluate spiritual or moral claims critically. Without intellectual grounding, discernment becomes difficult, and individuals become more vulnerable to confusion and manipulation. The second pillar involves the shaping of imagination. The speaker emphasizes that human beings do not act only based on logic, but also based on what they imagine and internalize over time. Through media, entertainment, advertising, and digital content, certain behaviors and lifestyles are repeatedly presented until they begin to feel normal or even desirable. Over time, repeated exposure to specific imagery and narratives does not just reflect culture, it actively reshapes it. Virtue becomes less appealing, while behaviors once considered morally problematic are reframed as expressions of freedom or authenticity. In this way, imagination becomes a channel through which values are gradually redefined. The third pillar is isolation. The argument here is that human beings are naturally strengthened by connection, family, community, and shared belief systems. When those bonds weaken, individuals become more emotionally and psychologically vulnerable. Isolation reduces resistance, not only socially, but also internally, as people lose external reference points that help guide decision-making and moral judgment. The speaker suggests that modern society, despite being more technologically connected than ever, has paradoxically produced higher levels of loneliness and disconnection. This is interpreted not as an accidental byproduct of modern life, but as a structural condition that increases vulnerability by separating individuals from stable communal support systems. The fourth pillar is the inversion of authority. Traditionally, authority structures such as parents, religious leaders, and moral traditions provided guidance and boundaries. In the modern framework described here, these structures are increasingly questioned or dismissed, while ultimate authority is relocated to the individual self. In this framework, personal desire becomes the highest reference point for truth and identity. The idea that I define myself replaces external moral frameworks. According to the speaker's interpretation, this shift is an ancient spiritual temptation. Idea that autonomy independent of divine order is the path to fulfillment. The fifth and final pillar is the removal of belief in the supernatural. This includes diminishing belief in concepts such as spiritual beings, moral consequences beyond physical life, or any reality beyond the material world. When people stop believing that there is a spiritual dimension to existence, they begin to interpret all experiences through purely material or psychological explanations. In this condition, spiritual vulnerability increases because there is no longer awareness of spiritual struggle. Individuals do not believe they are part of a larger moral or spiritual conflict. They are less likely to engage in any form of spiritual resistance. The speaker then extends this framework into the internal workings of the church itself. The claim is made that institutional weakening does not stop at the boundaries of religious institutions, but can also appear within them. This is framed not as an accusation against individuals, but as a pattern of influence that can manifest through confusion, misdirection, or dilution of teachings over time. The discussion acknowledges that not all failures or changes within religious structures are intentional or malicious. Many arise, according to the argument, from human weakness, fear of criticism, or a desire to align with contemporary cultural expectations. However, the cumulative effect of these decisions is described as a gradual weakening of clarity and conviction. One of the patterns identified is theological ambiguity. The speaker describes a shift where long-established teachings are presented in increasingly flexible or uncertain ways. Instead of being viewed as fixed truths, they are sometimes reframed as evolving interpretations. This creates uncertainty among believers about what is essential and what is optional. Another pattern is the diminishing focus on the supernatural dimension of faith. The speaker argues that in some environments, emphasis is placed heavily on social or psychological aspects of religion, while teachings on spiritual warfare, angels, demons, and the reality of evil are minimized or overlooked. The result, in this view, is a faith experience that feels more human-centered than spiritually engaged. A further concern raised is the formation of religious leaders. According to the speaker, there is a risk that future leaders may be trained more in administrative, social, or counseling roles than in spiritual authority and doctrinal clarity. This shift, it is argued, changes the way leadership is exercised, moving it away from firm spiritual guidance toward more therapeutic or managerial approaches. The discussion also touches on liturgical change, suggesting that how people worship influences what they believe. If worship becomes more centered on community expression than on sacrifice, transcendence, the internal perception of the sacred can shift accordingly. Over time, this can influence theological understanding at a deep level. Another issue raised is the misuse of mercy. Mercy, in its authentic form, is described as a central and essential aspect of faith. However, argument warns that if mercy is separated from truth, it can lose its meaning. Instead of guiding individuals toward transformation, it may unintentionally confirm people in patterns that are spiritually harmful. At this stage, the speaker emphasizes that these patterns are not presented as isolated issues, but as interconnected dynamics that reinforce one another. When theological ambiguity, reduced emphasis on spirituality, weakened leadership formation, altered worship practices, distorted understandings of mercy converge. They create an environment where clarity becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. The section closes by reinforcing the idea that these developments, whether intentional or not, align with broader cultural shifts already discussed. Implication is that institutional and cultural transformations are not separate stories, but parallel expressions of the same underlying process. The discussion now deepens into how these internal patterns are not isolated phenomena, but part of a wider spiritual struggle that extends across both society and religious institutions. The speaker emphasizes that even when individuals act without malicious intent, their decisions can still contribute to a larger pattern of weakening clarity and spiritual awareness over time. At this stage, attention turns more directly toward the idea of infiltration, not in a simplistic or conspiratorial sense, but as a gradual process of influence that operates through confusion, compromise, and misalignment of priorities. The claim is that institutions rarely collapse from a single external attack. Instead, they weaken internally through a series of small adjustments that over time shift their original purpose. One of the central patterns described is theological confusion within religious environments. The speaker argues that when foundational doctrines are treated as flexible or open to reinterpretation without clear boundaries, it becomes difficult for believers to distinguish between essential teachings and personal opinion. This creates a condition where certainty is replaced by ambiguity and conviction is replaced by preference. In such an environment, authority itself becomes less stable. Instead of being grounded in a consistent tradition, authority begins to shift toward personal interpretation. The result, according to the argument, is that individuals increasingly see themselves as the final judges of truth, even within a system that traditionally relies on received teaching and continuity. Closely connected to this is the weakening of awareness of the supernatural dimension of faith. The speaker stresses that when spiritual realities are not actively taught or emphasized, they gradually fade from practical awareness. As a result, religious practice can begin to resemble ethical or social instruction rather than engagement with a living spiritual reality. Shift has consequences, according to the narrative. Without a strong sense of spiritual reality, individuals are less prepared to recognize or respond to forms of spiritual struggle. The faith becomes more intellectual or emotional, but less operative in confronting unseen realities that, in this worldview, are actively influencing human life. Another concern raised is the formation of clergy. The speaker argues that when training focuses heavily on counseling skills, administrative responsibilities, or social engagement, it can unintentionally reduce emphasis on spiritual authority and doctrinal clarity. This is not presented as a rejection of those skills, but as a warning that they can become dominant at the expense of spiritual formation. In this view, a priest or religious leader is not only a community organizer or counselor, but someone engaged in spiritual leadership with responsibility for guiding others through moral and spiritual complexity. When that dimension is weakened, leadership becomes more about managing people than guiding souls. Discussion then turns to the nature of worship itself. The speaker emphasizes a traditional principle that how people worship shapes what they believe. If worship emphasizes transcendence, sacrifice, and reverence, reinforces a sense of divine mystery and moral seriousness, if it shifts toward informality and horizontal expression, perception of the sacred can change accordingly. This is not framed as a judgment of aesthetic preference, but as a theological concern about formation. Over time, repeated patterns of worship shape internal belief structures, often without conscious awareness. In this sense, liturgy is not just a ritual practice, but a formative environment that shapes spiritual perception. Another major theme is the reinterpretation of mercy. The speaker stresses that mercy, properly understood, is inseparable from truth, is not simply acceptance or affirmation, but a transformative force that calls a person toward change and healing. When mercy is detached from truth, it risks becoming a form of validation that leaves deeper problems unaddressed. In this framework, distortion occurs when compassion is redefined in a way that eliminates moral accountability. Instead of guiding individuals toward growth, may unintentionally reinforce patterns that are harmful to the soul. The speaker warns that this distortion can be particularly difficult to challenge because it appears on the surface to be virtuous. At this point, the narrative expands again to emphasize how these internal dynamics mirror broader cultural developments. The same patterns, confusion, definition of authority, weakening of moral clarity, and diminishing awareness of spiritual reality, are observed both inside and outside religious institutions. The speaker argues that this parallel is not coincidental, but indicative of a shared underlying direction. Cultural and institutional changes in this interpretation are not separate streams, but interconnected expressions of a single larger movement that affects how people understand truth, identity, and morality. Despite the seriousness of these claims, tone remains focused on analysis rather than despair. The argument is not that institutions have already failed completely, but that they are undergoing pressure and transformation that require awareness and discernment. This section closes by reinforcing the idea that understanding these patterns is essential before moving into the next layer of the discussion. What comes next is a broader examination of how these dynamics extend beyond institutions into society at large, particularly in relation to family, education, and the formation of younger generations. The focus now expands outward from institutional patterns into the broader cultural landscape, where the speaker argues that the same underlying dynamics can be observed shaping society at large. What was previously described within religious structures is now examined in families, education systems, and the formation of younger generations, suggesting that the influence being discussed is not confined to one domain, but is systemic in nature. One of the central concerns raised is the weakening of the family unit, particularly the diminishing role of the father. Argument presented is that the father's role is not merely functional or traditional, but foundational to the stability of the household. When that role is weakened, either through absence, disengagement, or cultural redefinition, the structure of the family becomes more vulnerable to fragmentation. The speaker connects this weakening directly to broader social outcomes. Increased rates of addiction, behavioral instability, identity confusion, and emotional distress are presented not as isolated phenomena, but as patterns that emerge consistently in environments where the family structure is unstable. Rather than viewing these issues separately, they are framed as interconnected results of a single underlying disruption. A theological dimension is then introduced. The family is described as more than a social arrangement. It is portrayed as a reflection of a deeper spiritual order. In this interpretation, the relationship between father, mother, and child symbolizes a structured harmony that mirrors divine relationships. When that structure is destabilized, it is not only social order that is affected, but also spiritual understanding. From here, the discussion shifts into historical development, particularly focusing on cultural movements of the 20th century. The speaker argues that major shifts in sexual norms and moral frameworks did not arise spontaneously in a single moment, but were preceded by decades of intellectual groundwork within academic and cultural institutions. Ideas developed in universities, psychological theories, and media narratives are described as gradually filtering into mainstream culture. Over time, these ideas moved from theoretical discussions into practical influence, shaping education, entertainment, and eventually public policy. In this view, cultural transformation is a slow process of intellectual diffusion rather than sudden change. However, the speaker emphasizes that this process is not purely intellectual or sociological. Human thinkers and institutions are acknowledged, but they are framed as part of a larger system of influence that operates on both visible and invisible levels. Some participants are described as fully aware of their goals, while others are seen as unknowingly contributing to outcomes they do not fully understand. The argument then returns to the concept of measurable outcomes, changes in religious participation, moral beliefs, family stability, and demographic trends are presented as indicators of deeper structural shifts. Declining church attendance, reduced sacramental participation, and lower birth rates in traditionally religious societies are interpreted not as random developments, but as signs of long-term transformation. Key point is made about generational knowledge loss. The speaker argues that foundational religious understanding, basic doctrines, moral teachings, and spiritual awareness has become significantly less present in younger populations. Many self-identified believers, according to this view, lack a clear understanding of core aspects of their own tradition. This is framed as more than a catechetical issue. It is described as a weakening of collective spiritual memory. When a tradition is no longer clearly transmitted, influence diminishes not only in practice but in identity. Over time, this leads to a situation where cultural identity and religious identity become increasingly disconnected. The discussion then introduces a broader interpretive claim that these developments are not unrelated but follow a coherent pattern of weakening foundational structures, intellectual, familial, spiritual, and cultural. Each layer reinforces the others, creating a feedback loop that accelerates change over time. The speaker again emphasizes that these patterns are not necessarily the result of a single coordinated human plan, but may emerge through a combination of ideological movements, institutional decisions, and deeper spiritual influences interpreted through a theological lens. At this point, attention begins to shift toward the impact on younger generations specifically. Argument suggests that children and adolescents are experiencing these cultural transformations at an accelerated rate, often without the protective frameworks that previous generations had, such as stable family structures, consistent moral teaching, or shared communal narratives. The section closes by preparing for a deeper examination of how these influences manifest directly in the formation of children, education systems, and digital environments. The implication is that the most concentrated effects of these broader patterns are now being observed in the next generation.